people of God, they moved quite a bit in these opening sections of the Old Testament. Our team, we left Israel, we flew to Egypt, and then we drove from Cairo down to Sinai. It was a 6 or 7 hour drive. It was a pretty long drive for us to get from Cairo down to Sinai. Imagine making that journey from Egypt down to Sinai in a period of time where there were no cars, there were no buses to travel with. The next snapshot in the story that we're putting together in OT Panoramic is that movement. The movement of the people from Egypt to Sinai. And why they went there and where they went from there is an important part of this story that we're painting. I'll see you on the mountain in just a minute.
After the age of the patriarchs, the Hebrew people multiplied, but not in the land once promised to Abraham. Sometime after Joseph died, a Pharaoh turned against Israel's people and enslaved them. We aren't told exactly when this happened, but we do know that the enslavement had gone on for most of their 400 years in Egypt, long enough to become part of the people of Israel's identity. Generations of Hebrews kept crying out to God, and when the time was right, He sent a deliverer at a time prophesied long before. That deliverer was Moses, a baby spared from a massacre of Israel's infants, who grew up in Pharaoh's household as an Egyptian, in spite of his Hebrew origins. He was perfectly positioned to become a mediator. He had a dual identity as Hebrew and Egyptian, and was in a place of influence. But he had not yet learned God's ways, and one day in anger, he killed an Egyptian who was abusing an Israelite. Moses, now an outlaw, fled across the desert and settled in Midian for 40 years. By the time God appeared to Moses at a burning bush and called him back to Egypt, against Moses' persistent protests, Moses was already 80. But God had heard the cries of His people and still planned a dramatic rescue. This epic story of deliverance includes 10 plagues against Egypt and numerous miracles on behalf of Israel. Spiritual standoffs in which God loosened the adversary's grip on His people. Leading up to the 10th plague, the dramatic climax, God told Israelites to mark their homes with sacrificial blood so death would pass over their firstborn sons. He led His people out of Egypt and to the edge of the Red Sea, and then, when all hope seemed lost, He parted the waters and led His people through on dry ground. The whole process of deliverance, from Passover to the far side of the sea, had been traumatic and unsettling. It took God's people from a terrible but familiar slavery to a promising but unfamiliar future. And many Israelites did not handle it well. But God led them out anyway, taking them to a place of extreme dependence and desperation, turning their gaze to Him. The moment before deliverance, with Pharaoh's army in pursuit, felt catastrophic. But on the other side of the sea were freedom, glory, and a mountain where God would make a deep and personal covenant with His people.
Where's somewhere that you would love to travel to that you've never been able to? Maybe even some exotic location that you think there's never a chance that you'll get to go there. One of the places that would be on my list is actually where I'm standing for the second session of OT Panoramic. We are on the top of Mount Sinai. It's just breathtaking, isn't it? It's quite an adventure to get up to the summit here. This will definitely be the most difficult mountain that we have to climb up. It's about 5 kilometers uphill to get up here. And then after that, there's 750 steps that have been carved into the side of the mountain that you climb up. It's pretty strenuous to get up here to the summit, but it is worth every step moving your way up here to the summit. Mount Sinai is a major transition moment for the people of God in the story of the Old Testament. We saw our first 2 snapshots, beginnings and patriarchs. Joseph, the last of the four patriarchs, ended up in Egypt. And after his death in Egypt, the people of God were sold into slavery and became slaves in Egypt. And God decided to rescue them out of their captivity and bondage. It was a dramatic rescue. There were the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, and Moses led the people to this region at Sinai. And the people come here down at the base of this mountain. Before and after this mountain, Mount Sinai, everything changes. We pick this story up in Exodus chapter 19, verse 1. On the first day of the 3rd month after the Israelites left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to the Israelites." Everything that happened on this mountain changes the story moving forward. After this, Moses goes down the mountain and he gathers all the people together and he says, "Here's what God says." And the people say, "Yes, we're in, we're committed." And so Moses comes back up to the top of the mountain and he gets the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law. And he goes back down after weeks, and the people had already forgotten their commitment, and they built a golden calf, and Moses throws the tablets of stone down, and they break, and Moses has to come back up, and he gets the law again from God, and it's quite a scene that unfolds in Exodus 19 and in the chapters that follow. Standing here on Mount Sinai, knowing all that happened, it's just remarkable. Thinking about all that happens here on this mountain and in this region. The theological or the religious significance of this, the giving of the law to the people of God. But beyond the religious significance of what happens on this mountain, all of the physical things that you read about in Exodus chapter 19 that happened right here, the thunder, and there was lightning, and God descends in a cloud. The mountain, we're told, trembles violently. There was a trumpet blast as God was descending down onto the mountain. We're told that the people down below in the valley looked up, and it looked as if the mountain top was consumed by fire. And as remarkable as all of that is, all of it pales in comparison to what God says in Exodus chapter 19, verse 4, 5, and 6. Listen again to these 3 verses. "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you are to speak to the Israelites." In those 3 verses, God tells Moses 3 very specific things. First, in verse 4, God says, "I rescued you." He says, I rescued you. You saw what I did in Egypt. You saw the dramatic and miraculous ways that I rescued you out of your captivity and slavery in Egypt. God says, it is as if I carried you on eagle's wings. Eagle's wings would have been a sign of God's protection and provision. God says, I rescued you, number one. Second, he asked for their obedience. He says in verse 5, now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant. God establishes a covenant with the people, enters into a formal relationship with them, and asks for their obedience. And then verse 6, he says, you'll be a blessing, a treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. Rescue, obedience, blessing. The order of those three ideas that we hear in Exodus chapter 19 is incredibly important. God rescues them, God delivers them, and then asks for their obedience. He didn't deliver them, He didn't rescue them because they were good enough. He rescues them, He delivers them out of a sign of His grace and His mercy that He shows them. Rescue comes before His request for their obedience. I think often we read the Old Testament and we think that God is just about laws. And if we follow enough laws in the Old Testament, then God would have delivered and saved them. And then in the New Testament, somewhere between Malachi at the end of the Old Testament and Matthew at the end of the New Testament, something changes and all of a sudden God is about grace and mercy. And I want you to hear that even in the giving of the law, in Exodus chapter 19, God reminds them that His rescue, His deliverance is not because they earned it, but because He is a God who is full of grace and mercy that He bestows upon this people. The Bible is one story about one God from the beginning of time to the story that He is writing in your life. And then in response to that request for their obedience, God says that they will be a blessed people. He says you'll be a treasured possession. The word there for treasured possession is the idea of the king's private possession. In the ancient world, it would have been said that the king owned everything. Everything within his kingdom ultimately belonged to the king. But the king had his own special possessions, the things that were his and his alone. It was his private treasure. God says, of all the things, God owns the entire universe. But He says, you will be my special treasured possessions. He says that you'll be a holy nation. The law that follows from Exodus chapter 19, we may sometimes read that law and scratch our heads about some of the rules and the regulations that are in there, but it was all about setting them apart from every other nation, making them holy, separate, distinct from every other nation. And then He says, you'll be a kingdom of priests. What did priests do? Priests were mediators. Priests stood between the people and God. The priest brought the people close to God. He says, you will be a kingdom of priests, not just announcing the grace and the mercy of God to the Israelites, but announcing the goodness of God to all the kingdoms. Kingdom of priests. God rescues. He asks for their obedience. And then He promises that they will truly be blessed. There's a passage in the New Testament in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of Him who called you out of darkness and into His wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Sound familiar? Peter in the New Testament, he's retelling the story of Exodus 19. Let that sink in for a minute. Moses is no longer going up and down the mountain representing the people down below to God above. Jesus went up on another mountain where there was thunder and there was darkness and there was the trembling of the earth. And through His death, He made a new covenant. And then God rescues us. not because we deserve it, not anything we've done, because He is a God who is rich in mercy and grace. And then He says, you're my special possession. Like the whole universe belongs to God, but He looks like right at you. And He says, you're special. Like you're kind of a big deal. You are my treasured possession. You are a holy nation. We should follow this book. We should follow the way the Bible tells us to live, not in order to earn God's favor or grace, but because we should be separate and distinct, responding to His grace. We're separate and distinct from all other nations around us. And we are a kingdom of priests. God calls us to go into all of the nations, into all of the peoples, announcing His goodness and His mercy, a kingdom of priests, telling others about the God that we serve. What I want you to hear from Mount Sinai is that we don't obey. We don't obey God to be delivered. We don't obey God to be rescued. God is a God of mercy and grace. And we see it all the way back in Exodus chapter 19. We see it here on the top of Mount Sinai. But because of God's rescue, we should, with all that we are, seek to live our lives following Him, worshiping Him, serving Him with everything we are. And so perhaps we could renew our commitment, aware of how God rescued us and saved us, renew our commitment to follow Him with everything that we are, so that we may be a blessing to the world around us, telling others of the love of our Savior, Jesus. I'll see you off the mountain in just a moment.
The law God gave His people at Sinai can come across as an elaborate list of rules, the do's and don'ts of religion, the form of ritual and obedience rather than the heart of faith. And that's often how human hearts interpret it. But if we take a closer look, we see something much deeper and more intimate. Later prophets would refer back to the momentous events at Mount Sinai as a betrothal ceremony, an engagement, a covenant of marriage between God and His beloved people. Far from representing the demands of a taskmaster God, the covenant spelled out godly character and human ethics. It painted pictures of high character, but also redemption and grace. It established a rhythm of life that would reflect the plan of salvation, and it called human beings into a tender, worshipful, personal relationship with Him. On God's part, this was an agreement to love His people, make them His own special possession, and bless the world through them. On the people's part, it was an agreement to love God in return and worship Him exclusively, to give their hearts entirely to Him. This law was not just about doing the right things. It was first and foremost about worship, the idols in their hearts, in their history, and at their altars. But the promises for keeping this covenant were extravagant. This was not meant to be a burdensome list of rituals and requirements. The law had plenty of practical implications for people's lives, of course. It spelled out how to live with integrity and treat people fairly, and in doing so, to demonstrate the nature of God. Its instructions for a beautiful, symbolic tabernacle set the stage for God to meet with His people regularly. A betrothal, after all, implies intimate communication. This tabernacle would be made of the finest materials and would be situated at the center of the camp, God in the midst of His beloved people. Levites, a tribe of priests, would preside over worship and sacrifices, which were often ordered around annual feasts that tell the story of redemption. In the spring, commemorations of deliverance. In the fall, celebrations of fulfillment. And in between, celebration of harvests and the hard work that went into them. The story of these feasts became our story too. We look back to our deliverance, look forward to our fulfillment, and labor now for the fruitfulness God has promised us. The law pictured much more than one people's instructions for life. This was a new era for Israel. On one hand, an exciting adventure full of promise and hope. On the other hand, an unfamiliar and unsettling journey with all kinds of obstacles and adversaries along the way. And even though they were glad to be out of Egypt, they had not yet learned how to live out their freedom. It would take another generation for God to get Egypt's ways out of them and train them in His.
I hope these snapshots are starting to be assembled into a beautiful panorama. Beginnings, patriarch, Egypt, law. The Israelites, they camped here at the base of Sinai for about a year. They put into practice all of the festivals and the feast of the law. They constructed the tabernacle where they worshiped. The rest of the book of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, and the first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers all take place here at the base of Sinai. And then they packed all their camps up and they set out on a journey. And that's our next session. Remember, there are two things that you can do to help this study have the greatest impact on your life. The first is, whether by yourself or with maybe the small group that you're watching OT Panoramic with, go through the study questions. Take some time, be open and honest and transparent with yourself and with others, and create opportunity for God to do some work in your life and in your heart. The second is to be faithful in the daily Bible reading schedule that accompanies OT Panoramic. You're not going to read the entire Old Testament, but follow along on this journey as we learn the big story of God's Word, and take this opportunity to read God's Word for yourself as we go through. We'll see you soon.
Alfa.